Hello and welcome back to the Baselight learning program. This week we're going to be covering shapes and how you can use them to create mattes in Baselight. As always, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll answer them at the end. Okay, let's get started. Shapes are used to create a layer matte, which is used in a grade layer to define inside and outside areas, which can be graded separately. Mattes are also used to selectively apply blending or to composite between different images. Let's take a look at this shot here as an example. The piano keys are a little bright, but if I make them darker, then the piano tuner sinks into the background, so we need to pull him back up again. So I'm going to use a shape matte to isolate him from the rest of the image so I can add a bit of extra lighting to him. So first I need to add a new layer to grade just the piano tuner, and I can easily do that just by pressing P on the keyboard. If you're working with a blackboard or a slate control panel, then you can just press the appropriate layer button on the panel. And then to add a shape, on the keyboard you just press S, and if you're working on the blackboard or the slate, there's actually a dedicated shape matte operator button in the stack manager area. And this adds a shape strip to the stack above the current layer strip, and it automatically selects the shape strip so the controls appear here in the parameters view. The new shape button is also enabled by default, so now all I need to do is put the mouse in the image display and click to start drawing a shape. Now you'll notice that when I click to add a point, it creates a straight line to the next point. If I want a curved line, I need to click and hold the mouse, or with the pen you just tap and hold the pen tip down, and then drag to pull out some handles. Now when I move to where I want the next point to be, you'll see that there's a curved line between the points. Now if you want to delete a point you just made because it's not in the right place, you can press Command and Delete, or that would be Control and Delete on a Linux system. And notice that I can draw points outside the image frame, which is handy if you need a shape which overlaps beyond the edges of the picture. To close the curve and to complete the shape, you can either click anywhere with the right mouse button, or on the pen, that would be the upper side switch on the pen, or you can click on top of the first point. And if you want to make that point a smooth point, you click and then hold the mouse button and drag to create some handles at that point. Otherwise you'd end up with a sharp point as the first or last point in the shape. So now the shape that I've drawn is creating a white area in the layer matte, and we can view the layer matte by pressing O. That's the keyboard shortcut to view the matte, and there's also a layer matte button in the cursor view controls on the blackboard or slate control panels. Incidentally, the different matte viewing modes are covered in the tutorial on cursors. So once you've completed the shape, you can still adjust it by clicking and dragging on any of the control points or the handles. And again, on the control panel, if you don't want to use the mouse, the trackballs and the associated buttons above the trackballs can also be used to select and move individual control points, or to move and change the dimensions of the overall shape. So you don't have to use the mouse or the pen if you don't want to, although I personally find it a lot easier to adjust shapes using the mouse. So if you made a sharp point and you want to make it smooth, you can hold down Command or Control on a Linux system and then drag handles out of the control point. They're actually there on a sharp point, but they've got 0 length. And while you're holding down Control or Command, you can also drag the handles around to split them, so you can then make a cusp or a spiky point rather than having the handles in a straight line, which makes a smooth point. If you want to add a new point on the curve to add a bit more detail, you just literally click anywhere on the curve. And you can also delete points on the curve by selecting it and again pressing Command or Control Delete on the keyboard. Multiple points can be selected by dragging a box around them, and you see they then get highlighted with a yellow glow. And then you can move them all together, or you can delete them all together. Note that if you try and delete all the points, it doesn't actually remove the curve completely. It'll always leave 2 points. If you actually want to delete the whole shape, then there's a Delete Selected Shape button over here, which will allow you to delete the whole shape. Incidentally, these techniques for selecting, moving and deleting points also apply to other places where control points are used in Baselight. For example, in the grid warp operator, which we'll be looking at in another tutorial. Okay, so now we've got a shape. You'll notice that the shape is contained within a blue transform box, which allows you to scale and rotate it. If you click on the corners, you can scale it freely, both horizontally and vertically. And if you click on one of the sides, it'll just scale it along that axis. The handle in the middle is used to move and rotate the shape. Now the red transform box applies to the curve within the shape. Now at the moment the shape is only made up of one curve, so the red box and the blue box effectively are going to do the same thing to the shape. However, if I need a more complex matte, then I can add more curves to the shape. So to do that, first I need to enable the Add New Curve button. That's here, it says Add New Curve to Shape. And now I'll just draw a simple curve here, just using a few points. And now you can see that the matte is actually made up of a single shape, because we've still got just one blue box, but inside that there are now 2 curves, and each one of those has their own red transform box. So the blue shape transform box now acts as an overall transform for both curves, and so I can scale the overall shape using the blue box, but if I want to individually scale or rotate either of the curves within that, then I can use their individual red transform boxes. And to switch between those 2 different curves, I just have to click within the curve area, and it will then highlight that curve and its red transform box. Now, one thing to note is if I move this second curve over the first one, you'll see that where they overlap, they actually cut into each other, so they're doing a subtraction type operation. And this is quite handy if you need to actually cut a hole in a shape matte. Now, as well as adding more curves to a shape, you can also add more shapes to the matte. And sometimes you do need to build up slightly more complex mattes than just one single shape covering one area. So if you want to add more shapes, you start off by enabling the New Shape button, or you can press Q on the keyboard. Now, if you remember when I started off with the first shape, that button was on by default, but as soon as I'd drawn the shape, the button turned itself off, so that you don't accidentally draw more shapes every time you click on the image. If you did actually want to draw more shapes one after another, and you didn't want to have to keep turning back on the New Shape button, you can turn on the Continuous button here, but personally I find that I mean, in most cases you don't just want to draw lots and lots of shapes one after the other, so it's probably better to leave that button off, but it's there if you need it. Okay, so now I've drawn a second shape, and you'll notice that if I now overlap that shape with the first one, then they literally just kind of join together and you can't see that they're 2 separate shapes anymore. And that's because they're being combined using a union operation. Now, if you actually wanted to use the second shape to obscure bits of the first shape, for example, if you had an object that you were grading and then another object passed in front of it, you could use a shape to obscure the first shape, and you would animate it in some way, either track it or add manual keyframes. So to change that, the mode for the second shape so it obscures the first one, you change the union operation to subtract. And now you'll see that that second smaller shape is actually basically blanking out the first shape that I drew. Each shape has an opacity control, so you can effectively reduce the amount that the grade affects the area covered by that individual shape. So if I reduce the opacity to say 50%, then the grade will only be half as strong within this shape. And where shapes overlap, their opacity is combined. Now there's a third mode, operation mode for shapes, which is called stamp. And if I select stamp, you'll notice that the opacity control has changed to an intensity control, which now allows me to actually set a specific grey level on the shape. Rather than having a transparency, it's now a certain level of grey between black and white. And that behaves a little bit differently because it means that I can actually put one shape on top of another and it will always have that amount of grey or amount of intensity. So that part of the image will always be grading the same amount, regardless of any other shapes that there are in the matte layer. And obviously, if you do that, then the order in which the shapes are stacked, if you like, behind each other is important. So we can actually change the order using these up and down arrow buttons here. Okay. So now you've seen how to draw shapes and add curves, and how the curves and shapes interact with each other. And obviously, if you needed to, you could build up quite a complex matte using multiple shapes with curves. You can adjust the positions, transparencies, or use the stamp mode to get exactly the right black and white and shades of grey that you need within your matte. However, in this particular case, I actually need just a very simple single curve matte. So I'm going to delete the shapes that I've drawn here, and we'll start again just with a simple shape. So I'll toggle back to the just to view the image again just by pressing O on the keyboard, and this time I'm going to draw just a simple ellipse. So first I need to press Q to select the new shape button, and from the curve mode, new shape curve mode drop down button, I'll select ellipse. And to draw an ellipse, you click and drag from the center outwards. So click and hold the mouse button down and then drag it out. Or if you're using the pen, you tap and hold the pen down, drag it, and then let go to define the ellipse that you're drawing. Okay, now I can scale it to the right size, and I'll rotate it a little bit just to line it up with the piano tuner. And now what I want to do is to actually adjust the grade inside that shape, just to make sure that it is actually doing what I expect. So I'll press S on the keyboard, which toggles me from the shape layer back to the grading controls. And you can also use these two buttons at the top here, the Mona Lisa buttons. If I click on the actual picture one, that takes me to the grading controls. If I click on the black and white button, then that takes me to the matte, which in this case is the shape controls. So I'm going to just use base grade to increase the exposure inside the shape, so that's where the white area of the shape is. Now obviously it doesn't look very good at the moment because the shape has a completely hard edge. So I'm going to use the feather control to soften the edge of the shape a little bit. Now that obviously looks better, but I can't see clearly what's going on because we've got the shape overlay on the image. Now I can either turn that off by going to the overlays button in the cursor's view, but that would actually turn it off permanently till I turn them back on again. So instead there's a button in the shape parameters over here which says hide overlays on edit. And when I turn that on, you'll see that as soon as I make any adjustment to the shape, while the adjustment is actually taking place, the overlay disappears. So as I adjust the feathering, you can see the image without the overlay. The overlay disappears while I'm actually making the adjustment, and not until I let go of the mouse on the feather control or on the blackboard if I'm turning one of the rotary controls, not until I actually stop turning it, will that overlay come back again. So you can more interactively see what you're doing while you're adjusting things. Okay, that looks about right in terms of exposure, but then now there are parts of the piano keyboard which are now getting a bit overexposed again. So I need to adjust the shape. Now, I started off with just a simple ellipse, but as you saw before, I can add more points to that to turn it into a more complex shape. So I'll just click and add a point on the curve here and drag it in a bit. And that looks a bit better, but I can still see that I can't really, if I drag it in too far, then I'm starting to take some of the light off the piano tuner. So I need to actually reduce the amount of feathering on that edge. If I switch back over to the mat by pressing O on the keyboard, you can see that the amount of feathering is obviously even around the shape. So I can't really just sort of tighten up that side of the shape and make the feathering tighter. So instead of using a single feathering mode, well, first of all, let me just show you. There's an option down here at the bottom, and sometimes you can't see the button, so you have to scroll the parameter view up a little bit, which gives you options on the roll-off or the feathering profile. Now, currently it's set to linear, but if I change it to one of these other options, for example, smoothed top end, you can see that it does give me a tighter feathering. And that's without reducing the feathering amount, but it still doesn't allow me to vary the feathering at different points in the shape. So I'll show you how you can do that now. So to enable variable feathering mode, I need to turn on the custom inner-outer curves button. Now, when I do that, the single feather radius slider is replaced with two sliders, one for inner scale and one for outer scale. And you'll notice that the feathering has completely been reset at this point. So if I now drag the outer scale up, you'll actually see that there were two curves instead of one. They started off just sitting on top of each other, but now you can see the outer curve is being pushed outwards outside the inner curve, and now the feathering is going between the inner curve and the outer curve. So by adjusting the size and the shape of those two curves, I can adjust the feathering all around the edge of the shape. So now you can link the inner and the outer control points, which defined the original curve, and that means that you can then move them together and retain the feathering amount at that point. But if you want to vary the amount of feathering at each of those points, you can unlink the control points, and that then allows me to bring them close together, which is what I want to do here, because I want to have a smaller amount of feathering, so I can have a tighter edge on the shape here, but I can increase the amount of feathering around other parts of it. And if I go back to the image view mode now, while I'm adjusting that, you can see that by interactively adjusting the inner and the outer curves, you can vary the amount of light effectively which is falling on different parts of the object. In fact, I can do that to maybe have the light that's falling on his back just at the top and not so much over his shoulder. So it's quite a powerful way to make fairly complex shapes just simply by adjusting these two inner and outer curves. Okay, let's have a quick look at the other new shape modes. So I'm actually going to move to the next shot just to demonstrate those. And again, I'll add a new grade layer, and then I'll add a shape to that layer. Now, we've already used the freehand and ellipse modes, so we'll have a look at the other ones now. A rectangle, as its name implies, draws a rectangle, and rather than drawing that from the middle outwards, you click and start at the top left-hand corner and then drag down to the bottom right-hand corner. And when you let go of the mouse, that then defines the rectangle. Now, although it's got square corners, these are actually, again, these are Bezier points with control handles. It's just the control handles at this point are 0 length. But as before, if you wanted to turn them into smooth points, you can hold down Command or Control and then drag out the handles, and you can see that now allows me to change my rectangle into any other kind of shape that I like. Okay, we're actually, I'm just going to come back to Edge. We'll talk about Edge in a minute. So let's have a look at the quick shapes, which is the button next. And if I click on that, you'll see there's a drop down of predefined shapes, and just simply by clicking on any of those, it will add whatever shape I want to the image. So for example, if I quickly want to add a vignette to this shot, I can just click on the vignette button and then go back to the grading controls and say use a base grade to darken down the outside of the shape. So that's the black parts of the matte. Or I could use corner if I wanted to sort of add some light coming from one corner of the image, or maybe add a spotlight effect. Now, the spotlight effect, the other shapes, the vignette and the corner, just use the single feathering mode, whereas the spotlight was defined using inner and outer curves. So I can now adjust, as before, I can now adjust the outer curve and the inner curve a little bit to modify that spotlight. Now, if I actually want that to be my kind of default spotlight effect, I can add that back into the quick shapes list by clicking on the customize button up at the top here, and then selecting new quick shape from the menu. And I can now go back in and I can give the quick shape a specific name. Now, there are actually only 2 custom quick shape slots available, and that's because these quick shape options are also mapped onto buttons on the blackboard, and there are only a certain number of buttons available. So incidentally, if you want to add a quick shape very quickly and you're using a blackboard or a slate control panel, you don't even need to use the mouse. You can literally just hit the button and the shape appears, and then you can just adjust it. So that's why they're called quick shapes. They're very, very quick. But if you want to add more than 2 customized shapes, you can actually overwrite any of the factory, the preset quick shapes. And there's a default button here which allows you to take them back to their default shapes as well if you want to. You'll also notice that the Customize menu allows you to set the defaults for various settings in the shape controls. So, for example, the default feathering profile can be set here, so you don't need to go in and change it each time you create a new shape. Also, you can set it so that it defaults to using inner and outer curves rather than the single feathering control. Okay, let's now go back and have a look at the edge shape, which is a little bit different from the others because it isn't actually a closed Bezier shape. It's literally just an edge, or a feathered edge. So I'm going to go to another shot to demonstrate when you may use the edge shape. So I'm going to use a matte to darken the sky in this particular shot. Now, rather than draw a shape around the sky, which I could do, but obviously I'd need to zoom the image back a little bit so I could make sure that the shape extended beyond the edges of the image. So in this case, I'm going to use the edge, and again, I'll add a grade layer and then add the shape. And now I'll select edge as the new shape mode. And to create the shape, I actually click where I want the edge to be and then drag upwards at 90 degrees to the line of the edge. And by dragging, what I'm actually doing is I'm defining the fall off or feathering away from the edge. So if I now switch over to the matte view, you can see what I've created, which is a horizontal edge, or nearly horizontal, which feathers up towards the sky. And I can now move the edge by clicking on the control point in the middle. I can rotate it, and I can adjust the feathering by dragging on the end of the arrow here. And again, you can use the controls, the trackball controls on the blackboard or the slate to make those adjustments. Now in this case, I want to grade the sky inside the matte, so I want that to be the white area rather than the black area. So I'm actually going to invert the matte so that it actually gets whiter towards the top. And again, down at the bottom here of the matte, of the shape parameters, there's an invert matte button. And you'll now see that the matte goes from black to white rather than white to black. Okay, and now I'll switch back over to view the grade by pressing S. And once again, I'll use the base grade on the inside of the matte to darken the sky. And as before, I can now, once I've got the grade, I can now interactively adjust the edge to get the shape in the right place. And I can also adjust the feathering amount, either just using the feathering control in the user interface here, or by adjusting the rotary control on the blackboard or the slate. And again, the feather profile may also it'll adjust the amount with which the shape, if you like, of the fall off of the edge, so that can also have an effect on the grade. So in this session, I've covered the different shape creation controls which you can use to create complex mattes with variable feathering, different densities and opacities to precisely separate areas for grading, as well as simple controls for just creating a very quick matte, maybe just a simple ellipse, or using quick shapes to just make quick adjustments to lighting. Now obviously shapes can be animated, they can be tracked, they can be combined with other mattes, and we'll be covering that in other sessions. So I hope that that was clear. There's quite a lot to cover, as always, in Baselight. And as I said, we'll be looking at doing keyframing and tracking of shapes in another tutorial. There was one question. I'm not entirely sure whether I understood it correctly, but it did make me realise that I'd forgotten to just show you how you would move the centre handle, or the handle of a shape or a curve to a different position. So I'll just jump back to the shot that I was drawing the shapes on originally. So here, so at the moment the blue handle is well, it was in the original center of the ellipse when I first drew it. If I want to put it in so that's obviously the center of rotation and scaling for that shape. But if I wanted to position it somewhere else, then I can hold down Control or Command and then just drag it to another position. So if I put it down here, then obviously now the shape will rotate around that axis position. So the question was actually, it was as if the center pivot was in another third dimension. Okay, well we do have, I obviously haven't shown you in this tutorial, but we do have the option to add a perspective plane in Baselight. And once you've done that, it's then possible to draw shapes on that plane. So they're no longer flat on the image plane. They're actually, if you've defined a perspective plane that sort of goes off into the distance across to an imaginary horizon, then if you draw a shape on that plane, then obviously it would appear that if you move the shape around, or if you moved the center pivot around, then it wouldn't move across the screen in 2D sense. It would move literally like it was moving in 3D. And we will be covering perspective and perspective planes in another tutorial. And yeah, you've just added to the comment about tracking, and yes, we can also track in that perspective plane. So we haven't looked at tracking in this tutorial, but we can either track just simply on the image plane, so that would be straightforward 2D flat tracking if you like, but we too also have the ability to track in 3D in a perspective plane. So okay, well, I'm glad I answered that question, and as I said, we'll be covering perspective in a separate tutorial. So thanks again for everybody that joined us today. I'll do a quick edit of this video, and then it'll be up on the website with the rest. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.